I found him by the light of my phone. My 6-year-old was curled up on the living room rug like a stray kitten, knees pulled to his chest, his little hands tucked under his shirt because there was no heat in the house. His lips had a bluish tint. His eyelashes were wet. When my beam hit his face, his eyes opened slow, unfocused, and he tried to smile like he didn't want to get in trouble for being scared. "Mom?" he whispered, and his voice cracked on the single syllable. I dropped my bag so hard it thudded against the coffee table. I was on my knees before I knew I'd moved, scooping him up. He felt too light, the way a child feels when you've missed meals and no one has noticed. His skin was cold through his pajama shirt. He was trembling so hard his teeth clicked against each other. "Hey, hey, hey!" My voice came out steady because my body knows how to go steady when something is wrong, but inside something ripped open. I'm here now. He clung to me with a grip that didn't belong to a kid who still believed the world was safe. His fingers dug into my coat like he was afraid I'd vanish. I pressed my cheek to his hair and smelled stale cereal and little boy sweat, and the faint metal scent of cold air. "How long?" I started, but the question was too big. He swallowed. Since the night with the loud wind. The night with the loud wind. 2 nights ago. The storm that rattled our gutters and turned the street into a tunnel of howling branches. I held him tighter and looked around the living room. The Christmas tree, our tree, was dark, unlit ornaments catching my phone's glare in dull flashes. The stockings we'd hung together were still there, but limp empty, like they were waiting for people who hadn't come home. The thermostat on the wall blinked an error message. No hum of the furnace. No warm breath from the vents. Just silence and cold so sharp it felt like it had teeth. Then I saw the note. It lay on the kitchen counter right beside the fruit bowl, and the stack of mail as ordinary as a grocery list. A single sheet of lined paper torn from a kid's notebook. 4 words in thick black marker, blunt and casual. "Manchester United, back next week." My mouth went dry. For a moment I couldn't understand it, like my brain refused to translate what my eyes were seeing. Manchester United, like the soccer team on TV, the one he'd started watching lately, yelling at the screen like it mattered more than the people in the room. Back next week, like there was no urgency, no responsibility, no child. I shifted my son on my hip. He was still shaking. I could feel each tremor run through his small frame into mine like an electrical current. "Sweetheart," I said softly, keeping my voice gentle because that's what he needed. "Did anyone come by Mrs. O'Donnell next door, Mr. Harris?" He blinked up at me slow. "No, I knocked on the wall like you said, but nobody opened." I'd told him months ago that if he ever felt scared, he could knock on the shared wall between our living room and Mrs. O'Donnell's house. An old trick from the days when I lived in places where you didn't always have a phone. I'd set it like a game. Knock 3 times, pause, knock again. He'd remembered, he'd tried, and no one answered. I turned, half carrying, half supporting him, into the kitchen. The floor tiles were so cold my boots squeaked. I set him in a chair and wrapped my scarf around his shoulders like a blanket. His eyes followed my hands. He watched everything the way kids do when they've learned they can't depend on the adults to keep things normal. The refrigerator was almost empty. A jar of pickles, a carton of eggs, milk that had gone sour. No leftovers, no bread, no fruit, no little plastic containers of the snacks I always kept stocked because he's 6 and 6-year-olds get hungry every 10 minutes like it's their job. The pantry door stood cracked open. Inside, the cereal boxes were tipped sideways, light as air, the bottom corners torn where someone had shaken out the last dry handful. I saw a can of soup on the floor and a spoon beside it. He must have tried to open it and couldn't. I imagined him turning it over, staring at the metal like it was a problem he could solve by willpower. My chest tightened so hard it hurt to breathe. "Did you eat?" I asked. He nodded quickly, eager to please. I had the crunchy circles. And I drank water. "You did good," I said, because I needed him to hear that. "You did so good." His eyes flicked to the note on the counter. He said he'd be back soon. He, not Dad, not a name, just he. I picked up the note and felt my hand start to shake, the first crack in the calm shell I'd been wearing since I stepped through the door. The marker strokes were so thick they bled into the paper fibers. Whoever wrote this had pressed down hard like they wanted the words to be permanent. I looked at the kitchen clock. The second hand moved with a slow, patient tick. The kind of ticking that tells you time doesn't care what you want. Time passes whether you're home or not, whether your child is warm or cold, whether you meant to come back or you didn't. Outside through the window above the sink, I could see my street quiet suburban, the kind of neighborhood where people wave and put out little flags on holidays. A wreath hung on the lamppost. Someone down the block had an inflatable Santa slumped sideways in the yard like it had given up. We were supposed to be one of those houses. We were supposed to be normal. I went to the thermostat and pressed the buttons. Nothing happened. I opened the utility closet and stared at the furnace. No lights, no sound. I flipped the breaker box in the garage and listened. Silence. The cold wasn't just an inconvenience, it had settled into the bones of the house. I took out my phone and checked my messages. No missed calls, no frantic texts from anyone saying something happened. I can't get back. Nothing. The last message I'd sent 2 days ago was a photo of a Christmas tree at the airport with the words, "Almost home." No reply. I knelt beside my son again. His cheeks were pale, his hair stuck up on one side like he'd slept in the same spot too long. "Listen to me," I said, and this time my voice sharpened just enough to cut through his fog. "You're safe now. Do you understand? You are safe. I'm not going anywhere." He nodded, but his eyes didn't fully believe me yet. I reached for my coat pocket and found the tiny emergency hand warmer packet I'd forgotten was there. I tore it open and rubbed it between my palms until it started to heat, then pressed it into his hands. "Hold that," I said. "I'm going to get help, okay? I'm going to make everything warm." He whispered, "Are you mad?" The question nearly broke me. A child left alone in the dark for days, and he's worried about my anger. "No," I said, and I meant it with every piece of myself. "Not at you. Never at you." I stood up and looked around the kitchen again, forcing my brain to organize the facts the way it does when there's an emergency. Cold house, no food, no adult. A note that sounded like a joke written by someone who thought a sports team mattered more than a child. My hands were steady now. That steadiness wasn't comfort, it was something colder and harder, a line being drawn. I picked up my phone and started dialing, not even sure who I was calling, first utilities, a neighbor, the police, when my son's small voice floated up behind me. "Mom," he said, almost like he was telling me the weather. "I waited for you. I waited by the window." I turned and saw him sitting in the chair with my scarf around his shoulders, clutching the warm packet like a lifeline. In the dim kitchen light, he looked older than 6, not in his body but in his eyes. And in that instant, the truth landed fully, heavy and undeniable. He hadn't just been cold. He hadn't just been hungry. He had been alone. For 2 days. The ER smelled like antiseptic and burnt coffee, the kind that sits too long on a hot plate. It was close to midnight, but the waiting room was still half full. People hunched over phones, a man with a bloody towel wrapped around his hand. An older woman rocking slowly with her eyes closed. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Everything looked washed out, like color had been drained from the world. I carried my son through the automatic doors because he leaned too heavily on me to walk on his own. A nurse at triage took one look at his lips and waved us forward. "How long was he exposed to the cold?" she asked. I opened my mouth, then closed it. I didn't want my son to hear the answer in my voice. "About 2 days," I said finally. Her eyebrows lifted just slightly. She nodded and typed faster. They wrapped him in warm blankets and checked his vitals. His temperature was low, not dangerously, so they said, but low enough to matter. Mild dehydration, elevated heart rate. Nothing that would kill him, they assured me, but enough to leave marks that wouldn't show up on an X-ray. He's lucky, the doctor said, a man in his late 50s with gray at his temples and a calm voice that sounded like it had delivered bad news gently for decades. Kids are resilient. But this could have gone a different way. Lucky. The word echoed in my head and landed wrong. Luck had nothing to do with this. My son hadn't been saved by chance. He'd survived because he followed instructions like a soldier follows orders. When the nurse stepped out, I sat beside the bed and watched him sleep. His face had relaxed now that the heat was seeping back into his body. The blankets rose and fell with his breathing. Every so often his brow twitched like he was still listening for something even in sleep. I brushed his hair back with my fingers and noticed the small things I'd missed at first. The faint dark circles under his eyes. The way his hands clenched even when he slept. the tiny scab on his knuckle probably from trying to pry open that soup can. "What did you do when you got scared?" I asked quietly when he stirred. He opened one eye. I talked to Bear. Bear was the stuffed animal he'd had since he was 2, the one with one ear flopped over and a seam I'd stitched back together more than once. "What did you tell him?" He thought for a moment. I told him the rules. "The rules." My chest tightened. "What rules?" "The ones you said," he murmured. "Don't go outside, don't open the door, drink water, wait." I swallowed hard. Months ago before I left, I'd sat him down at the kitchen table and talked through emergencies the way I always do, slow, calm, practical. I'd framed it as a game. I never imagined he'd need it like this. "You did exactly right," I said. He nodded satisfied and drifted back to sleep. While he rested, a social worker came by. She introduced herself and explained carefully that this was standard procedure. Anytime a child came in under circumstances like these, there had to be documentation, questions, reports. I welcomed it. I answered everything plainly. When she asked about the note, I showed it to her. She didn't comment, just copied the words into her file. "Do you feel your child is safe at home?" she asked. "Yes," I said, "with me." She paused, pen hovering. "And the other adult?" I met her eyes, not unsupervised. She nodded once. That was enough. We left the hospital just before dawn. The sky was pale, the kind of gray-blue that looks almost gentle after a long night. My son walked this time wrapped in my coat, his small hand tucked into mine. The parking lot was slick with frost. My breath came out in white clouds. On the drive home, he watched the passing houses through the window. "Are we going to have pancakes?" he asked. "Yes," I said, my voice steady. "All the pancakes you want." At home, the house still felt cold, but it was a different kind of cold now, exposed, inspected. I turned on every light. I put water on to boil and filled the sink with warm, soapy water. The normal sounds, running water, clinking dishes, felt like proof of life. While he ate, I made calls. The utility company confirmed the furnace had shut down during the storm. It could have been fixed in a day if someone had called. The school district confirmed he'd been marked absent for 2 days. No follow-up call had been made yet because of the holiday schedule. Each answer stacked on the last building a clear picture. There had been chances to fix this, chances to come back, chances to ask for help. None were taken. After breakfast, my son sat at the table coloring while I cleaned up. He stayed close, his chair angled so he could see me at all times. "Mom," he asked suddenly. "Yes." "When you're gone, do you think about me?" I set the plate down carefully, every day. He considered that. I thought maybe you forgot. The words hit harder than anything the doctor had said. I crouched in front of him and took his hands. "I didn't forget. I would never forget you. Sometimes adults make bad choices, but that doesn't mean you weren't important." He nodded slowly, absorbing it the way children do, without argument but with questions that would come later. That afternoon, after he fell asleep on the couch with Bear tucked under his chin, I sat at the kitchen table and looked at the note again. 4 words. No apology, no explanation. Just an assumption that everything would be fine because someone else would deal with it. I folded the paper carefully and placed it in a folder with the hospital discharge papers and the school attendance report. I labeled the folder with a black pen and slid it into my bag. I didn't feel angry the way movies make anger look. There was no heat in it. What I felt was something quieter and heavier, a certainty. 2 days had done something to my child. Not something dramatic or obvious, something subtle. He listened more closely now. He checked in more often. He watched doors. Those changes mattered. And they would be answered. I waited until my son was asleep before I made the call. Not because I was afraid of what I'd hear, but because I didn't want him to hear the tone of my voice when I spoke. Children notice those things. They file them away. I wanted his last memory of the day to be pancakes and warmth and the steady rhythm of the dishwasher humming in the kitchen. I sat at the small desk in the corner of the living room, the one we used for bills and homework. The house was finally warming up. The furnace repairman had come by in the afternoon, shaking his head as he worked. "Should have been an easy call," he'd said. "Storm knocked it out, but nothing major." An easy call, another chance that had been ignored. I pulled the folder from my bag and spread the contents out on the desk like a quiet inventory. Hospital discharge papers, notes from the social worker, the copy of the school's attendance record. And on top of it all, the folded piece of lined paper with those 4 words written in heavy marker. I stared at it for a long moment, then picked up my phone. The lawyer answered on the second ring. "Hello," he said. His voice was calm, familiar. We'd known each other a long enough that we didn't waste words. "It's me," I said. He paused. "Are you home?" "Yes." Another pause. "Is your son with you?" "He is. He's asleep." There was a soft exhale on the other end of the line. Not relief exactly, more like readiness. "Tell me what happened." I did, but not the way people expect stories to be told. I didn't start with feelings. I started with facts. I told him the temperature in the house, the number of days, the empty refrigerator, the note, the hospital visit. I gave him times and dates. I could hear his pen moving as I spoke. When I finished, there was silence. Not the awkward kind, the kind that means someone is thinking carefully. "Did you document everything he asked?" "Yes." "Medical records?" "Yes." "School?" "Yes." "Any witnesses?" I thought of Mrs. O'Donnell next door, of the unanswered knocks. "Not yet," I said. "But I can." "Good," he said. "Do that." I waited. This was the part where people usually offered comfort or outrage. He didn't do either. Instead, he said the 6 words that changed the shape of the room. "This is child abandonment. We proceed." The words landed cleanly. No drama, no hesitation. Just a statement of fact and a decision. "Okay," I said. That was it. No shaking hands, no rush of adrenaline, just a quiet click inside me as everything aligned. "We'll do this by the book," he continued. "That's important. You don't need to provoke anything. Don't confront him. Don't warn him. Let him come back thinking everything is normal." "Understood." "I'll file the report first thing tomorrow. Child Protective Services will be notified. We'll request emergency custody adjustments. Temporary, at least." I pictured my son asleep on the couch, bear tucked under his chin, his fingers curled like he was still holding on to something. "Do it," I said. After we hung up, I didn't move for a long time. I sat there and listened to the house. The furnace kicked on and off. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere down the block, a car door slammed. Ordinary sounds. Proof that the world was still turning. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel cruel. What I felt was the same thing I feel before any serious operation focus. Over the next few days, I did exactly what the lawyer said. I didn't call, I didn't text, I didn't ask where he was or when he was coming back. Silence can be a kind of discipline if you use it correctly. I gathered statements. Mrs. O'Donnell confirmed she hadn't seen anyone come or go. The school secretary wrote a note explaining the absence and the lack of follow-up due to the holiday. The furnace company provided a report showing the system had been offline for 48 hours. I kept everything neat, labeled, dated. My son stayed close to me, but he started to relax. The color came back to his cheeks. He laughed when we decorated cookies. He stopped asking if I was mad. One evening, as we sat on the couch watching an old holiday movie, he leaned his head against my arm. "Are we okay now?" he asked. "Yes," I said, "we are." "What about when he comes back?" There it was, the question I'd been preparing for. I didn't lie. "Some things will change," I said carefully. "But you won't be alone again." He thought about that. Then he nodded. "Okay." When the message finally came 2 days later, it was brief and casual. "Back tomorrow. Flight got delayed." No apology, no concern, just logistics. I handed my phone to the lawyer without comment when he arrived at my office the next morning. He read the message and nodded. "Good," he said. "Timing works." "Is this going to be hard on my son?" I asked. He met my eyes. It would be harder to teach him that this was acceptable. That answer mattered. The night before the return, I sat at the kitchen table again. The same table where I'd once explained emergency rules like it was a game. I looked around the house, warm now, stocked with food, steady and quiet. Revenge isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just refusing to pretend nothing happened. Sometimes it's making sure a child learns that adults are accountable. And sometimes it starts with a phone call made in a calm voice after the house has finally gone still. People have asked me since then how I stayed so calm. They imagine something dramatic, raised voices, slammed doors, tears that blur the edges of the world. They imagine rage. I let them imagine it because explaining the truth takes longer. The truth is, calm isn't something I put on when things go wrong. It's something that shows up when I need it the way muscle memory does. I didn't learn it from books or seminars. I learned it the long way in places where panic gets people hurt. I never told my son what I do for a living in detail. To him, I'm just someone who goes away sometimes and comes back with different haircuts and fewer words. He knows I work for the government the way kids understand those things, like it's a far-off building full of adults who drink coffee and make rules. He doesn't need more than that. But the habits come home with me whether I want them to or not. I inventory rooms without thinking. I notice exits. I listen for sounds that don't belong. When the house was cold and silent, I didn't freeze, not because I didn't feel fear, but because fear knows how to take a back seat when there's work to do. That doesn't make me special. It makes me trained. The morning after the lawyer's call, I woke before dawn the way I always do. The house was quiet. I made coffee and stood at the window watching the street come alive. A jogger passed by. Someone scraped ice off a windshield. Ordinary life carried on indifferent to what was unfolding inside my walls. I didn't rehearse speeches. I didn't imagine confrontations. I focused on what mattered. My son woke up and padded into the kitchen in his socks, hair sticking up in the back. He climbed into his chair and watched me pour cereal. "Is it a school day?" he asked. "Not today," I said. "Holiday week." "Oh," he said, relieved. "Can we go to the library?" "Yes." That was the rhythm I wanted to restore. Questions, answered plans, made days that followed a shape. At the library, he wandered over to the children's section and curled up with a stack of books. I sat nearby, pretending to read while keeping one eye on the door. Old habits again. They don't turn off just because the setting is safe. A woman across from me smiled and nodded the way strangers do when they recognize something familiar. I wondered what she saw: a mother spending quiet time with her child, or something tighter in my posture, something held back. Back home, I cleaned. Not because the house was dirty, but because order helps me think. I scrubbed counters until they shone. I lined up shoes by the door. I restocked the pantry. Each action was small, but together they formed a structure I could stand inside. That afternoon, I opened a drawer I don't visit often and took out a small metal box. Inside were things I don't talk about: old IDs, faded photos, a folded flag given to me after someone else didn't come home. I didn't touch any of it. I just confirmed it was there, then put the box back. I wasn't drawing strength from the past. I was reminding myself who I already was. When my phone rang that evening, I knew who it was before I looked. I let it ring twice before answering. "I'm back tomorrow," he said. "We need to talk." "We will," I replied. He sounded surprised by how normal my voice was. People expect anger. They don't know what to do with calm. "You could have called," he said. "You could have come home," I said. Not sharp, not accusing, just factual. There was a pause. "You're overreacting." That word overreacting has been used on women for generations to excuse other people's failures. I let it pass. "We'll talk tomorrow," I said again, and ended the call. That night after my son went to bed, I sat on the edge of his mattress and watched him sleep. His breathing had evened out over the past few days. He didn't twitch as much anymore. Still, his hand rested on Bear's ear, holding it tight. I thought about the first time I'd left him overnight. How I'd stood in the doorway longer than necessary, memorizing the curve of his cheek, the rise and fall of his chest. How I'd told myself that loving someone means trusting that the world won't always break them. Trust, I've learned, is not blind. It's earned and maintained. When it's broken, you don't ignore it. You respond. The next morning I woke early again. I dressed neatly, not formally, but with intention. Jeans, a sweater, clean boots. The kind of clothes that don't draw attention but don't apologize either. My son ate breakfast quietly, watching me. "Are you going somewhere?" he asked. "No," I said. "We're staying home today." That seemed to please him. He nodded and focused on his toast. At 10 minutes past 11, a car pulled into the driveway. I watched through the window as the door opened, as a familiar shape stepped out and stretched like he was coming back from something ordinary. I didn't rush to the door. I waited until he knocked. When I opened it, I saw the moment he noticed the changes, the warmth, the stocked shelves visible through the doorway, the calm order of the house. His eyes flicked past me, searching. "Where is he?" he asked. "In the living room," I said, "with his book." He stepped inside and I closed the door behind him. I didn't block his path. I didn't raise my voice. I simply stood there, grounded, present. This wasn't a battlefield, it was a reckoning. And I was exactly who I needed to be for it. He didn't take his shoes off when he walked in. That was the first thing I noticed. Not because it mattered, but because it told me how he saw this moment as temporary, as something he'd pass through and leave behind without consequence. He glanced toward the living room, already preparing whatever explanation he'd rehearsed on the flight home. My son sat on the rug with a library book open on his lap. He looked up, then back down again. No excitement, no running hug. Just a flicker of recognition followed by caution. That flicker said everything. "Hey, buddy," he said, forcing cheer into his voice. "I'm back." My son didn't answer. He turned the page. Something tightened in the air. I stepped slightly to the side, not blocking the view, but not clearing the way either. I didn't have to say a word. The house itself felt different now, warmer, fuller, awake. It didn't welcome him the way it used to. "We should talk," he said, lowering his voice. "Privately." "We will," I replied, "but not the way you think." He frowned. What does that mean? It meant the lawyer was already on his way. It meant the paperwork had been filed. It meant the situation had moved past improvisation. But I didn't explain. I didn't need to. "You scared him," he said, suddenly nodding toward the living room as if that ended the discussion. "He doesn't understand. You know how kids are." I kept my eyes on him. "He understands more than you think." He scoffed. I left a note. "Yes," I said, "you did." "That's not abandonment," he snapped. "I was gone for a few days. People travel." "People make arrangements," I said calmly. "Parents don't disappear." His jaw tightened. "You're blowing this out of proportion." There it was again. The minimization. The confidence that if he said it plainly enough, reality would bend to fit his version. Before I could respond, there was a knock at the door. I turned and opened it without hesitation. My lawyer stepped inside, coat still on, briefcase in hand. He nodded to me, then to the man standing in my hallway. "Good morning," he said evenly. "I'm here regarding your son." The color drained from his face in stages. Confusion first, then anger, then something close to fear. "What is this?" he demanded. "Why is he here?" My lawyer set his briefcase on the table and opened it. He didn't rush. He didn't perform. He laid things out one by one like evidence deserves to be treated. On December 23rd, he began. "Your child was left alone in a residence without heat, adequate food, or adult supervision for approximately 48 hours. That's not," he started. "Please don't interrupt," my lawyer said, still polite. "There is medical documentation confirming hypothermia exposure and dehydration. There is a note in your handwriting stating your intent to be away for an extended period. There are school attendance records, and there is a report filed with Child Protective Services." The room felt very quiet. My son had stopped reading. He watched from the edge of the living room, his small face serious, his shoulders drawn in. I caught his eye and gave the smallest nod. "You're okay." "This is insane," he said. "You can't do this." "I didn't," I said. "You did." He turned to me, his voice rising. "I trusted you to handle things while I was gone." "You didn't tell me you were leaving," I said. "And I wasn't home." Silence followed. Not because he had no response, but because there wasn't one that worked. "This is about control," he said finally. "You're punishing me." "No," my lawyer said. "This is about safety." He laughed, a short, sharp sound. He was fine. My son flinched. That was the moment something broke permanently. "He was not fine," I said. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. He was cold. He was hungry. He waited by the window for 2 days because he thought someone would come back for him. The words hung there heavy. My lawyer slid a document across the table. "Effective immediately," he said, "there will be supervised visitation only. This is temporary pending review. Any attempt to remove the child without authorization will result in immediate legal action." "You can't keep him from me," he said, his voice shaking now. "I'm not," I said. "Your choices did." He looked toward the living room again, desperation creeping in. "Come on, buddy, tell them you were okay." My son didn't move. I stepped between them without thinking, not aggressively, just enough. "He doesn't need to speak for himself," I said. "The facts already have." There was a long pause. In it, I saw something I hadn't seen before, not remorse exactly, but realization. The understanding that the version of the story he'd been telling himself no longer mattered. I didn't think he said quietly. "That's the problem," I replied. The CPS worker arrived shortly after, introduced herself, and explained the next steps. She spoke gently, clearly. No accusations, just boundaries. When it was over, when the papers were signed and the instructions given, he stood in the doorway again, shoes still on. "I'll call," he said. "You'll follow the process," my lawyer corrected. He nodded stiffly and left. The door closed behind him with a soft click. My son let out a breath he'd been holding and leaned into my side. I wrapped my arm around him and felt his weight settle, trusting. "I'm proud of you," I whispered. "For what?" he asked. "For knowing you deserved better." He thought about that, then nodded. Revenge didn't look like shouting or humiliation. It looked like a child standing safely in his own home while accountability finally caught up. The house felt different after he left. Not emptier, quieter, as if something that didn't belong there anymore had finally been removed. My lawyer gathered his papers, gave me a look that asked a question without words. I nodded. He understood. He always did. "I'll be in touch," he said. "You did the right thing." I didn't answer right away. I watched my son drag Bear across the rug, arranging him beside the couch the way he always did before bedtime, even though it was still afternoon. "Thank you," I said finally. When the door closed behind the lawyer, I sank down onto the couch. The adrenaline that had kept me upright drained away, leaving a dull ache in its place. My hands were steady, but my shoulders felt heavy, like I'd been carrying something for a long time and had only just set it down. "Is he mad at me?" my son asked. I turned to him. "No." "Is he mad at you?" "Probably," I said honestly, "but that's not your job to worry about." He nodded, accepting it. Children don't need perfect explanations, they need clear ones. That night after he fell asleep, I sat alone at the kitchen table. The folder was still there, thicker now, with new documents added to it. Consequences have weight. You can feel them when you stack the papers together. I thought I'd feel satisfaction, vindication, some sense of victory. Instead, what I felt was grief, not for what was lost, but for what never existed in the first place. The version of a family that looks fine from the outside but collapses the moment it's tested. Over the next weeks, the process moved forward the way processes do, slowly, methodically, without emotion. There were interviews, home visits, phone calls at inconvenient times. I answered every question the same way, clearly, calmly, with facts. The CPS worker visited again and watched my son play. She noted how often he looked toward me, how he checked in with his eyes before speaking. She didn't say much, but she didn't need to. "You're doing well," she said to him before she left. He smiled at that, a real smile. The supervised visits began shortly after. They were held in a neutral room with plastic chairs and a box of donated toys. I didn't attend. I waited in the car instead, reading or staring at nothing, trusting the system I'd chosen to engage. When my son came back from the first visit, he was quiet. "How was it?" I asked. He shrugged. "We played cards." "Did you feel okay?" He thought for a moment. It was strange. Strange how he kept saying sorry, he said, but he said it like when people say it fast. I nodded. Children are excellent judges of sincerity. "Do you want to go again next time?" I asked. "Yes," he said after another pause, "but I want you to be close." "I will be," I said, and I meant it in every sense of the word. At night after the house went quiet, I thought about the word revenge. People use it like it's a fire-hot, consuming, destructive. But what we were doing wasn't about punishment. It was about drawing lines so clear they couldn't be stepped over again without consequence. Justice, I've learned, isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It just shows up steady and unyielding and asks everyone to live with the truth of their actions. One evening, as I tucked my son into bed, he asked, "Did I do something wrong?" "No," I said immediately. "Then why did this happen?" I sat on the edge of the mattress and chose my words carefully. Because sometimes adults put what they want ahead of what they're responsible for. And when that happens, other adults have to step in. "Like you did?" "Yes." He nodded, satisfied. "I'm glad you came home." "So am I said and kissed his forehead. The reconciliation that followed wasn't a reunion. It was a restructuring. Apologies were made, some sincere, some incomplete. Rules were set, boundaries were reinforced. Trust, once broken, wasn't handed back freely. It was measured, tested, earned in small increments. And I learned something too. I learned that strength doesn't always look like endurance. Sometimes it looks like intervention, like stopping a pattern before it becomes a legacy, like teaching a child through action rather than words that they matter enough to be protected. On a quiet Sunday afternoon months later, my son sat beside me on the porch, swinging his legs and eating an apple. "Mom," he said. "Yes. If someone leaves you alone again, what should you do?" I smiled gently. "You won't be alone again." He considered that, then nodded. "Okay." The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the yard. The world felt ordinary again, and that was its own kind of victory. The first time I realized the fear was loosening its grip, it wasn't dramatic. It happened on a Tuesday. My son forgot his jacket at school. The old version of him, the one who had waited by the window, would have gone quiet, maybe tearful, bracing himself for discomfort the way children do when they think no one is coming. Instead, he shrugged when he realized it at dinner. "I'll get it tomorrow," he said, and went back to his peas. I watched him carefully, pretending not to notice. Healing doesn't announce itself. It shows up in small moments when you least expect it. Life didn't return to what it was before. It became something else, simpler in some ways, heavier in others, but honest. The supervised visits continued. Sometimes they went well, sometimes they didn't. I never asked for details unless my son offered them. I let him decide how much of his story he wanted to tell. That choice mattered. Trust, I learned, grows when you stop forcing people to perform feelings on demand. One afternoon after a visit, my son climbed into the passenger seat and buckled himself in. He stared out the window for a long time before speaking. He asked if I missed him, he said. "And what did you say?" "I said I missed when things felt normal," he replied. I nodded. That answer held more wisdom than most adults manage in a lifetime. The legal process moved toward its conclusion quietly. Agreements were signed, conditions were set. There was no dramatic courtroom scene, no final speech. Just a clear record and a future with safeguards in place. Some people were uncomfortable with that. Friends asked if I felt bad. Relatives hinted that I'd gone too far. A few said things like, "He didn't mean it," or "Everyone makes mistakes." They weren't wrong. People do make mistakes. But mistakes are moments. This was a pattern. And patterns don't change unless something interrupts them. One evening after my son had gone to bed, I sat alone in the living room and looked at the Christmas tree we'd finally taken down. A bare corner remained where it had stood, lighter than the rest of the floor, like a reminder. I thought about how close we'd come to teaching him the wrong lesson. Not the lesson that the world can be cruel, that one comes on its own, but the lesson that cruelty should be tolerated for the sake of peace. That silence is the same as forgiveness. That children should adapt to adult failures instead of the other way around. I was glad we hadn't taught him that. Reconciliation, when it came, didn't look like forgetting. It looked like responsibility. It looked like showing up on time. Like keeping promises small enough to be kept. Like understanding that love without accountability is just another kind of neglect. There were moments of grace. There always are if you leave room for them. Apologies improved. Effort became visible. Not perfect, but real. And through it all, my son learned something quietly powerful. He learned that adults can be wrong and still be held to standards. He learned that asking for help isn't weakness. He learned that safety is not something you earn by being good. It's something you deserve because you exist. One night, months later, as I tucked him in, he asked a question that stopped me cold. "Mom," he said, "do you think you're strong?" I smiled softly. "Sometimes." "I think you are," he said. "Not like superheroes, just steady." Steady. That word stayed with me. Strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it hums low and constant, like a furnace you make sure never goes cold again. If there's one thing I hope stays with you after hearing this story, it's this. Pay attention to what's being normalized around you. Silence, absence, shrugged off responsibility. They don't arrive all at once. They slip in quietly, disguised as inconvenience, as excuses, as "it'll be fine." And sometimes it isn't. If you're a parent, a grandparent, a neighbor, or just someone who cares, trust your discomfort. Ask the extra question. Make the call. Step in sooner rather than later. Because children remember who showed up. They remember warmth. They remember who came home. If this story made you pause, if it stirred a memory or a feeling you hadn't named before, take a moment. Share it with someone who might need it. talk about it, reflect on it. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories about accountability, quiet strength, and the choices that shape families, stay with us. Subscribe. Leave a comment. Let your voice be part of the conversation. Some lessons are too important to keep to ourselves.